Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Conversations. My name is Einav Avni, and I'm an alignment coach and energy healer. This podcast is Untangled Healing. No, it's not Untangled Healing. It's Healing Conversations for anything chronic. And the idea behind it is really to bring the message of alternative healing to anyone suffering from chronic pain, chronic illness, or unexplained medical conditions. Today with me is the wonderful Barbara Arrowsmith-Young. And before I say hi, I want to read you her bio so that we are all more aligned to what the conversation is all about. So here we are. Right. So, an innovator and author in the field of neuroeducation, Barbara Arrowsmith-Young's work utilizing the principle of neuroplasticity um, is used worldwide to enhance cognitive functioning. Her vision is to put the brain in education equation. Her work began in 1978 and is recognized as one of the first examples of the practical application of neuroplasticity to address learning difficulties, and its application has extended to address those dealing with traumatic brain injury, addiction, cognitive decline with aging, and those who want to enhance performance. Her journey and work is documented in her best-selling book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, and in her TEDx talk. As the director of the Arrowsmith program, Barbara continues to engage in research to understand how we can drive neuroplastic change in the brain to benefit learners of all ages. Barbara, hello. It's so wonderful to have you here.
This is an absolute pleasure and delight to be here. Thank you.
I'm really excited about this conversation, and I'd like you to just start by telling us something, anything about you, and wherever you want to start.
Okay, so I'll kind of start with my origin story. I mean, this work grew out of my personal struggles with learning difficulties, and it's. I always think of this work as both personal and universal. I mean, the personal is my story, my quest for a solution to overcome my challenges, and the universal is that we all have a brain. We all have our own unique cognitive profile of strengths and weaknesses. Like each one of us is rather unique. And if we can understand and harness this concept of neuroplasticity, which just means our brain is capable of change, we can actually shape our brain. So not only does our brain shape who we are because it filters our perceptions and understanding of ourselves, of other people, of our world. But to me, what's so promising is, if we can take neuroplasticity and apply it, we can actually shape our brain. So for me, I started school many, many years ago in the sort of mid to late 1950s. And at that time, the belief was your brain was fixed. Like there wasn't a concept of neuroplasticity. So in grade one, my teacher identified me as having learning challenges. Even at that time, there wasn't a concept of having a learning disability or a learning difficulty. You were either intelligent or you weren't. So I was put in that not intelligent bucket, and put in like the turtles group, which I'm not sure why teachers thought, naming us after animals would disguise the fact that the turtles group was not the group that one wanted to be, part of. And certainly, my teacher was accurate in that, I struggled all the way through education. So she told my mother that all of my learning, my time through school would be a challenge. She also said not to have high expectations for me. She told my mother that, and that I wouldn't be very successful. So I hope that part wasn't accurate. But that was the belief system and the understanding at that time. I struggled to learn how to read. I struggled to learn how to write. Numbers didn't mean anything to me. So if somebody gave me, 12 plus 14, I'd add the 4 and the 1 and the 2 and the 1, because it was just sort of, it was a series of random numbers that you did something with. So I do understand, I was very frustrating for my teacher because she was confronted by a student that didn't learn like the other children in the class. So as children with learning difficulties do, I started developing a bunch of coping mechanisms, not necessarily, endearing again to my teacher. So I would, hide out in the washroom for half of the class. I would fake illness to stay home, because schooling really was very stressful for me. I can't think of a single day that I, skipped to school with joy and excitement. I sort of dragged myself to school with like fear and trepidation. So that was my beginnings. It was in what I call the time of the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. So again, the belief that if there was a difficulty with learning, you had to learn how to live with it and compensate and work around. And I was very lucky. I had two parents that were very inspiring. My father was an inventor and a scientist, and he had this belief. He said, if there's a problem in the world and no solution, he said, it's your responsibility to go out and find a solution. And then he said, if the world tells you you can't do it, he said, don't listen. He said, this is how science goes forward. So that was, he set me on a quest. I had no idea, how I was going to solve this problem, but that was always there in my, belief system, my mindset. And then my mother really believed in being of service to others. She was an educator, and she ensured that I learned how to read, that I learned how to write, that I learned how to do basic mathematics. It didn't address the underlying learning difficulties, but it allowed me, to read and write and do basic mathematics. So that was the beginning of this. I basically started on a quest. And if I look at all of my education, I went to university to study child development, really to try to understand, what was wrong with my development, and then did my master's in school psychology, which is trying to understand, again, what happens when somebody struggles with learning. And then somebody it was the summer, August of 1977, handed me a book, The Man with the Shattered World, written by the Russian neuropsychologist Luria. And that changed my life. And that's why I dedicate my book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, to Luria, because I owe a life debt to him. This book told the story of a Russian soldier who had a very localized head wound during World War II. And the book was this man's journal, talking about all the things that he struggled with, and then Lurie explaining what was going on in this man's brain. And as I read, it was Leo Zazetsky was the name of the soldier. As I read his story, I thought, oh my gosh, like, this is my story. I mean, I knew I didn't have shrapnel in my brain, but now I knew that it was my brain that, was the source of my difficulty. And, to solve a problem, you have to understand what's the nature of the problem you're trying to solve. So now I knew parts of my brain weren't working the way they were designed to work. So that was Luria's contribution. And then at the same time, I was reading Mark Rosenzweig's work coming out of Berkeley, looking at neuroplasticity. And he was working with rats and finding that stimulation led to physiological and functional changes in the brains of rats. And they became better at learning mazes, which is like a little rat intelligence test. So I figured, okay, if rats have neuroplasticity, surely humans have neuroplasticity. It just seemed kind of obvious to me. And so I went to all my professors. I was at the University of Toronto at that time, really excited. Oh my gosh, I understand what my difficulties are. I think, I can create a solution to them. And they all looked at me and said, because again, this was in 1977, well, we know like after age 10 or 11, your brain is fixed. Well, again, that was the belief at that time. And I was a little older than, 10 or 11. So they said, and they also said, that was one of the challenges, but they also said learning difficulties weren't related to the brain. I mean, now we know they are, but at that time, I'm not sure where they thought they resided, but it wasn't the brain. So again, I remembered what my dad said, if the world tells you you can't do it, he said, go out and try. And I had no idea if I'd be successful, but I went back into Luria's work, tried to understand, what was the nature of that part of the brain, what was its job, and then created several different exercises because I had multiple learning difficulties and saw the change in my life. Like it was like the blinders or the blinkers came off and I could do things after the exercises that I couldn't do before. And then I thought, I want to take this work out into the world. It's wonderful that it's helped me, but I want to help others. And that was kind of a long-winded way to tell, like, this is how this work evolved. It was really out of my need to find a way to overcome my learning challenges. And now we train educators around the world to bring this program into their schools, their learning centers, their clinics, to support individuals, whether they're 5 years old or 95 years old, to stimulate and strengthen parts of their brain.
Amazing. And I've just only started reading the book. I just share with everyone. And as I was reading it, I was mind blown by everything I've read and everything that I hear you describing, because I can't even begin to imagine what it's like to not have the ability to, yeah, read and write is one thing, but also, like you mentioning, the cause and effect and relationship between things, and thinking where everything that you've had achieved, and all the way that you've managed to everything you've managed to overcome is mind blowing completely. Um, so I think I want to start there. I mean, at the beginning, you mentioning, right, not obviously not being able to read and not being a turtle. um, so basically, are you saying basically that the work that your mom was doing with you, helping you to learn how to read, was that really, in a sense, the first exercise into the brain to change that, because it was really helping you to create something that wasn't there before?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I'm sure that there was some positive change. Absolutely. Like anytime we do any kind of learning, our brain changes. Absolutely. So, I mean, she used flashcards, a lot of rote and repetition. So, I would say there was probably absolutely some change, but it's not at the level of what I'm talking about in the work that I developed, because it's it could have been, I did have some strengths. I didn't have just the learning difficulties. So
Yes.
it's quite possible that, with that massive repetition of the activity that my mother created for me, that allowed me to use some of my strengths to compensate for the difficulties. And that's traditionally, even up to till today, what is used if a child has a learning difficulty. They find workarounds. So they look at, okay, here's the difficulty, here are the strengths. Let's use the strengths to support the difficulties. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, it takes a lot of extra energy, right? So it might take 100 times more effort and work to learn the task, because the parts of the brain that are designed to really learn that are under functioning. And then you're having to pull in other resources in the brain that aren't fully designed to do that task. And that's what you see with students with learning difficulties, is what I call heroic effort. And we've done some imaging of students, fMRI, so the functional magnetic resonance imaging, to look at what is happening in the brain if you have a learning difficulty. And then we look at as the individual goes through this work, what are the changes? So interesting, what we see in the brain of students with learning difficulties is a brain that's working much harder than the brain of a student without a learning difficulty, and much less efficiently. So they're putting in this extra effort and energy, but not getting the same results, which is exactly their experience in the classroom. They're putting in more effort and energy, but not getting the same results as their peers. And what we see in the brain is a pattern of what we call hyperconnectivity and underconnectivity. So the underconnectivity are in the areas where the learning difficulties are, because those functions aren't performing properly. So they're not working as well. And then the brain in compensation hyperconnects other areas. So those other areas are trying to compensate, for the underperforming areas. And they're trying really hard, but they can't fully do that, because that's not what they're designed to do. And what we see as individuals go through this work is those underconnected areas start to strengthen in connectivity, and then the hyperconnected areas can start to reduce. They don't have to work as hard. So what you get is a brain that's much more efficient and more effective. And one of the really exciting things we see too is creativity blossoms in students, because all that energy that was going in to compensate now is freed up to use for the creative process. We've had students that, have gone into writing poetry, writing lyrics to songs, writing music. So it frees energy to be used to do other things. And to me, when I think about what is this work doing, I think, when we enhance those cognitive functions, we're opening possibilities for the learner. Like it's like, many, many doors open of possibilities that were closed before because of the challenges. I mean, I know, again, in my life, when I was ready to go out in the work world, there weren't a lot of doors open because I struggled. And I truly believe nobody would want to hire me because of my difficulties. I figured I wasn't really an asset. And I've worked with a lot of adults that talk about that when they went to pick their career, there might have been only one or two doors that were possible. And, I see this work as allowing many more doors to be open. And maybe the individual will still choose, those one or two, but now it's a choice that's, a free choice rather than a forced choice. So, I'm very passionate about this work. And you mentioned in the intro that we're taking it out to working with individuals with addiction, because we know addiction wires the brain in a negative way. So we're working with a group in Teen Challenge in Australia, in Toowoomba, in Queensland. And we've got some really promising research there as they go through the program and rewire their brain, that they can have more insight that then can be used beneficially in the therapeutic process. We're working with people with acquired brain injury through an organization called ABI Wellness. We're working, as we're getting older, I'll put up my hand there, that there's, a bit of cognitive decline, just keeping our brain sharp as we age. And then just students in regular classrooms. Also mental health. We absolutely see, I know for me, I struggled with depression for many, many years. I attempted suicide at age 13 because of the struggles of the learning difficulties. So again, we see the benefit of this work across a whole range of challenges or difficulty. And this is called healing conversation. Certainly, this is an aspect or a piece of healing, because if one doesn't have the cognitive capacity to have insight, it's really hard to benefit from therapy. I could have been in therapy forever and I couldn't, make connections. I couldn't understand if this happens, then that happens, or this happens because of that. I didn't have any insight into really how the world worked, how I worked. And I've worked with, different psychiatrists who have had clients that they've referred to this work, and they say at a certain point, as the individual's going through the exercise, they can benefit from insight, which is really, really critical, and have more compassion for themselves, compassion for others. We see emotional intelligence improve, empathy. So my goal is to make this work accessible around the world.
Mm-hmm. And I want to ask a few questions. First of all, it strikes me that, as you're saying, the education system, a lot of the time, like in your case, you're being labeled as not clever enough, or with challenges and stuff like that. So it's very much maybe the education system is looking at you as at face value, and here you say actually it's the brain is not working in the same way, and the frustration and that it must go for people to, when they recognize that actually their brain is not working as maybe other people's brains do. And when I hear you say that the education system is not geared to understand how to deal with people with learning difficulties, then my first question is really, have you seen any improvement in that area in schools and education, other than the work that you specifically do, like you say, with all learners?
I'd say that there has been more understanding of learning diversity, like since, from when I started, understanding that we learn differently. In my schooling, it was like assuming we're all cookie cutters and, that we all learned exactly the same way. So I would say there's certainly growth in understanding that we have different strengths and weaknesses. We learn differently. I'd say there's some good, educational systems out there that identify that, and then try to deliver the curriculum in different ways to meet the profile of the learner. So that's positive. I would say the next step is not saying let's make the curriculum meet the profile of the learner. Let's change the profile of the learner so they can meet any curriculum expectations, right? Because the one is coming from the presupposition that the learner's fixed, that recognizing, yes, we all have different profiles, but those profiles are fixed, and we're trying to adapt the external to meet that profile. So adapt the curriculum. I'm saying, no, we can actually change fundamentally the profile of the learner, so we don't have to modify the curriculum. Like we're changing the cognitive capacity of the learner to meet any curriculum. And to me, what's so powerful about that is that then serves the person for life. Because yes, in school, there's an opportunity to modify the curriculum, but you get out there in the workforce, and there's very few opportunities where your job is going to be modified to meet your profile. So to me, the power is, let's change fundamentally the capacity of the learner to learn, and then for the rest of their life, they can walk around with that enhanced brain and apply it not only just to learning in work, but in relationships, all aspects of their life, solving all the problems. Like we know life presents lots of problems, and it's through our cognitive capacity that we have the wherewithal to solve those problems. So to me, that's the power. And I also see, in our work, that there are a lot more educational systems that are open to looking at this kind of work, understanding, yes, this is very powerful. If we can change the brain of the learner, then we're giving them a resource, not just for today, but for the future. So, I think we're now in 14 different countries with this work, and I won't be satisfied until we're in pretty much every country. But yeah, so I would see that there's a growth and a shift. Education still, a lot of it sees their goal as teaching fundamental skills like reading, writing, arithmetic, also skills of thinking, problem solving, collaboration. But if we look at where do those skills come from, it's from the brain. Like, where's the capacity to learn those? So I'm very optimistic that we are moving in that direction, and that we'll see, my rallying cry, putting the brain in the education equation, because we go to school to learn. We learn with our brain. So not only should we be providing curriculum, for content, but also programs to stimulate cognition, to stimulate the brain. To me, that's the beautiful marriage of neuroscience and education.
Yeah, amazing. And so we talk about neuroplasticity and understanding that the brain can change, but I feel that there is still a lot of us out there that maybe don't really understand what that means. I mean, maybe even we understand that the brain can change and it's not fixed. I think we understand that, but what does it practically mean that we can change the brain? How do we do this?
Yeah. Well, obviously I've developed programs for 19 different cognitive functions, but the things that we can do in our everyday life, like there's certain principles, right, that drive neuroplastic change that's meaningful. As I said, pretty much anytime we're learning, the brain is changing, but some of that's very temporary, very transitory. So if you want to drive some significant change, there's this concept of effort for processing. Like, it comes out of Tracy Shor's lab at Rutgers University. And it's the idea, if we're doing something really simple, I guarantee you it's not going to drive change in the brain. I mean, it probably is enjoyable because we're going to be successful. And if we do something that's way out of our reach, that's not going to drive neuroplastic change, because we're not going to be able to really engage or attain it. So it's similar to, like, you go to the gym, and if you decide I'm going to lift 1 pound every day, well, that's not going to drive change. Or I'm going to try to start with 200 pounds. Well, you're not going to be successful. So it's really finding an activity that you want to engage in and then calibrate the level of difficulty. So look at where you're currently able to function with whatever that activity is, and then just bring it up a notch, right? Like just one notch above that, and then engage with the activity. And then once that becomes easy, like it feels like you're lifting that 1 pound, then increase the notch of difficulty, and that drives effort for processing, which drives meaningful change. So it doesn't really matter what you do, whether you want to do crosswords or Sudoku, whether you want to learn how to dance. It's the other thing is really pick an activity that you're going to want to engage with. Because again, to drive change in the brain, you need active, sustained engagement, right? If you only do it for 5 minutes every other day, it's not going to drive significant change. So the rule of thumb is, sort of like even like aerobic exercise, 20 to 30 minutes of engagement, maybe over the 3 or 4 hours over the course of a week. So active, sustained engagement and effort for processing are really, really critical features to add, and you can add that to anything that you do. And then there's the idea of novelty, right? So if you're driving to work on the same route every day, mix it up and maybe pick a different route. Do some things that are novel, right? Because again, as soon as something is novel, it engages the brain. Like it starts that effort for processing. It starts, wow, the brain gets curious, it gets more engaged. So those are the kinds of things anybody can do in their normal activity. And then there's the work that I've developed that's really targeted to specific cognitive functions. So if there's a problem with visual memory of symbol patterns, which is critical for reading, we have a whole program that exposes individuals to, I think, 44 different symbol patterns with the whole process of how they have to go through being able to visually memorize and recognize. And we start, again, that idea fairly simple, and then we increase the complexity. And again, it's novel because these are symbol patterns they're not familiar with, and they have to do it a certain number of minutes every day. So in my work, each exercise is for specific cognitive functions. So we have ones for visual memory, auditory memory, reasoning, executive functioning, thinking, planning, problem solving, nonverbal. So the person is awkward socially and can't read nonverbal cues, face blindness. We have a program for trying to remember numeracy, spatial reasoning, mechanical reasoning, which is critical for engineering or architecture. I kind of lose track of all of them, but we have programs for multiple different cognitive functions that are very, very specific to stimulate that. But as I said, in your everyday life, you can take these principles and make what you're doing a good workout for the brain to keep your brain active and stimulated.
And so we're saying that, because you mentioned something about temporary, but we're basically saying that if we take one of these programs and we keep at it and we do all the exercise, is the change permanent, or do we always need to continue working on it, like going to the gym and continue?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is, we've tracked people, myself, like over 40 years out of the program. We've tracked people 30 years out of the program, 20 years out of the program, and we see no drop off of function. So once that capacity has been strengthened, I believe what happens, why the person doesn't have to keep doing the exercise, is that now that function is working in concert with the rest of the brain. And getting its stimulation. Whereas before, if you think about, these areas were working up here, these areas were here, it was kind of a drag on the system. Now they're up and engaged and getting their stimulation every day by being able to work within that neural network. So that's what I believe theoretically is happening. Practically, we don't see any drop off of function. Once the area's strengthened, it remains functional and working at that new level.
Yeah. And I have so many questions. The next question I want to ask is, you've mentioned addictions, and I read in the book also about something like OCD, which I guess it's maybe similar in some ways. What are we saying that someone who is developing addictions, for example, is this something that we can kind of foresee before they actually end up with the addiction, or is it something that we only understand that they just happen to go down this route, and now we understand. I don't know actually how to ask the question, but
Yeah, yeah. It's. I think. I mean, this is not my area of expertise. Like, there's a fabulous book called The Biology of Desire by Mark Lewis, and he's a neuroscientist that. Um, Interestingly, he suffered from addiction. So I can't remember what his first book was, but it was about his story. And then Biology of Desire is his view as a neuroscientist on addiction. And it's really, really fascinating. So if anybody's interested, I'd recommend reading that book. So, and they might have insights as to whether you can see characteristics. I mean, certainly, there are probably risk factors that one could identify. Like, certainly we see it in individuals with learning difficulties, with the frustration and sometimes moving to self-medication to try to, their way of coping with the frustrations of feeling like they don't fit in, the learning difficulties. So, you can identify some of those risk factors. Now, whether that individual will go into addiction or not, but if we can identify risk factors that are going to lead to challenges with mental health, then we should be identifying them and addressing them very early. Certainly, if you have struggle with like consequential thinking or insight, you're probably more at risk for challenges with mental health, whether that's addiction. I mean, another group are, young offenders, like that group that ends up getting into trouble with the legal system. And I've had a couple of students sentenced to me by the courts, again, because of that challenge with consequential thinking, that challenge with insight and reasoning, and not being able to say, well, if I do this, that might be the consequence. And in those cases, we addressed those cognitive functions, and 25 years later, they've never had trouble with the law. I'm working with a group in Madrid in Spain right now to try to set up a study looking at that population with one of my exercises. So I think, again, I would never say this is the only piece of the puzzle of these challenges, but it is a piece, right? If the person can't do that consequential thinking or can't have that insight or do that cause and effect, they're much more at risk of having some kind of struggle with mental health, whatever that might be. You give them that capacity, they can make different choices and they can benefit from the therapeutic process. I remember one individual that had been in psychoanalysis for a number of years, and her therapist was suggesting that she was resisting, the therapy. Well, she wasn't resisting, but she had that significant what I call symbol relations problem, the same difficulty I had, and she couldn't make those connections, right? So, I think about some people that might be in therapy that are being, it's being suggested that they're being resistant, which then makes them feel even worse. And is that cognitively they're not able to benefit from therapy. And that's, that's a piece that this work can do. So I think it's a piece of the puzzle. And that's why I'd love to get this into regular schools as a normal part of curriculum. So those individuals that maybe by 14 or 15 or 16 would be going down a path that's not very constructive, if, in grade 1 or 2 or 3, these areas were enhanced, maybe they wouldn't be going down that path as an adolescent. I think it's a piece.
So it's really interesting what you're saying about the therapy part, because I had that as one of my questions of really, if we can change the brain to get results, then kind of how does one know if to go to therapy or to basically go and do the exercises instead? Because it sounds like, at least in some areas, the brain work would be more beneficial than usual therapy.
I think it's a combination, right? Again, I don't think anything is multiply determined. I mean, there may be some individuals that they get the cognitive work early on and never run into, the mental health or the difficulties that might lead them to need therapy. And then there can be other individuals that, the cognitive work will be of benefit, allow them to benefit from therapy, and they'll need the therapeutic process because there are other things going on in their life that require that. But then they'll have the insight. I remember a young woman who was a lawyer, and had been in therapy again for a number of years. And there's a video on our website of her talking about this. And she and her therapist said that after she did this work, it's like kind of in 1 month, it was like a year of therapy, because now she can make the connections and understand what her therapist, had been communicating with her. So I don't think this will ever replace therapy. I think therapy is really, really important for a lot of individuals, but it will allow the therapeutic process to be more effective for those individuals. So that's sort of my my view.
And I want to ask more specifically about healing and and really how if we can change the brain to basically get ourselves out of illness or chronic situations and stuff like that.
So sorry, I'm not quite sure what the question is.
So if we're saying that we're able to change the brain to teach ourselves new things, to basically wake up or bring the parts of the brain that are not functioning properly to start to kind of reboot them, is this something that we can do the same when we're talking about healings? I know that it's not exactly the same as what I'm kind of asking, but when I was younger, I remember there was a story about someone from the place where I grew up, and there was a bomb that went off, and he got very badly injured, and the doctors decided that it would be beneficial if they removed the leg, but they needed to wait for, I don't know, I guess to get permission from his mom or something like that. And so they had to put it on hold for a couple of days. And then by the time they came back, they did some more tests and they realized that actually the brain was able to send kind of, kind of new commands so that whatever was injured was able to start regrowth. And then they didn't need to amputate at the end of the day. So I'm kind of thinking about this story, and I'm wondering, people who suffer from chronic pain and chronic illnesses and stuff like that, is there something that they can do like that with the brain, that they would be able to send messages to? I mean, I guess maybe that's also part of meditation. I am somehow using everything.
Yeah, well, there's really good work going on with neuroplasticity and pain, right? So, but it's out of my field. But I would say, if there are any of your listeners that are struggling with chronic pain, which I also do, a separate issue. It's been probably like 35 years that like there isn't a day that I don't have some pain, right? And so I've sought out research on neuroplasticity and pain, meditation and pain. There's an interesting little documentary I just watched with Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama, and there's one little clip that shows pain signals and how they're interpreted in people that meditate, or Buddhist monks, and people who don't. And oh my gosh, it was such an eye-opener. So I would encourage anybody that's listening that's struggling with pain to just go in and Google neuroplasticity and pain. There's certainly some practitioners I worked with in the United States. They're practitioners. There's definitely really good research going on in Australia. To me, what's so promising about neuroplasticity is it allows us to use an inherent function in human beings to address conditions that we thought were fixed, right? I mean, I had an injury a number of years ago that triggered chronic regional pain syndrome. And if anybody's experienced that, like there's a McGill pain pain scale that goes from 0 to 50. Cancer is sort of at 25 or 30. This is at 45. Like it was pain like like I'd never experienced. And so I looked at the research. I pulled out one of my exercises. People know about phantom limb because my brain was starting to rewire the pain signals. So if someone would touch me on a part of my body that shouldn't be in pain, it was starting to experience pain. So I had one of my brothers build a mirror therapy box, like that Ramachandran's work. And I did mirror therapy, right, to train my brain to retrain those pain signals. So, there's so much really promising work out there, like, again, that can support people that are living with chronic pain. So, I would encourage people is just Google neuroplasticity and pain and start exploring all of what's out there and find what works for you, because there are multiple techniques, and one might be a better fit for me and another one might be a better fit for you. So, but I would really encourage people to investigate that, and certainly it's been really beneficial in my life.
And I want to ask, going back to the time, in your book, I read about the reading the clock exercises that you were doing, and then realizing that it works and that you're feeling better than you did before, and that you could do things that you couldn't before. What was it like then to say, hey, it works for me, I want to bring it out into the world? How was that part of the journey? Because you must have had a lot of resistance and a lot of trying to convince people that things are different to what they think. What was that like?
It was very interesting because I saw these changes and I documented them, right? I mean, I'm a little scientist, right? So I did pre and post tests and all sorts of things, and I was so excited, right? Because I knew I was a really hard worker and persistent before, and the change was profound, like that I could do things now and understand things that before, with the best will in the world, I could not do. It did not matter. I couldn't do, and now I could. So I thought, wow, there is human neuroplasticity. My professors, it wasn't just my professors, but it was, kind of the worldview at that time isn't accurate. And now we know that that's the case. So I thought people were going to be really excited, like I was, and that wasn't the case because, it's the paradigm. People were in what I call the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. That was where science was. I mean, definitely there were people in labs and like, Rosenzweig at Berkeley, looking at this concept of neuroplasticity, but this had not made it through the, mainstream system. And so, people were not excited. They weren't interested. They did not believe that this was possible. So they discounted it. And I thought, okay, I have a couple of options. One option is I can fight the system and spend lots of energy trying to convince people, or I can start working with people and develop more and more programs, because I developed 3 programs for myself, and now we have 19 different ones. And I said, and if there's truth to what I'm doing, if this is accurate, then over time, science will catch up and the world will catch up. And that's what happened. So I chose option number 2, mainly because I'm probably not a very confrontational person. And I felt like the best avenue to be successful with this was to just continue, put my head down, continue working, continue developing programs. And, there were some people that thought this was intriguing and, started coming to the work or referring people to the work. And the first several years, it was like a series of naturalistic experiments. It was really exciting because people would walk through the door with different problems than I had. So obviously the exercise I created for myself weren't the right ones for them. I'd go back into Luria's work, read, kind of come up with a series of questions, go back to that individual, like kind of ask them the questions, try to explore, set up little experiments. And, sometimes some of what I created ended up in the garbage pail because, that's science. You've got to accept that you're going to fail. But over time, that's how this work evolved to where it is today. And it's constantly evolving and developing. I mean, the fundamental principles of the exercises are the same, but I learned so much from the people that walked through the door, whether in my program or somewhere in the world. And I realized, okay, I've got to create another level, or I've got to create another component here, because this person is figuring out a way to compensate, which as soon as you compensate, you're not driving the stimulation specifically to that part of the brain. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful for everybody that's come to this work to help evolve it, and all the educators that have taken it on. So I'd say now that I think things have shifted, and we've got so much research behind us. I mean, when I started, it was really hard to find even researchers that were interested in working with me. And now, we've got a global research initiative with researchers in like Canada, the United States, in Madrid, in Spain. So, and we're all working, looking at, and also Australia, the outcomes of this work. So, and the application, because I think we all have a brain, we can all stimulate it, right? I mean, I had a student once many years ago that came to me, had a number of learning difficulties. We addressed them, and he'd always wanted to be an architect. That had been his dream. And his mechanical reasoning was at the 50th percentile, which that's average. Like that, nobody would consider that a difficulty. But, to get into architecture, I think he had to be at the 90th percentile, right? And so I thought, okay, I didn't have a program for that at the time. Went back in, read, thought about it, created a program. We got him. We got that capacity up to the 90th percentile. And he's now been an architect for, I think, at least 30 years. So yes, it's I find the work very exciting and rewarding, and as I said earlier, it creates possibilities and opportunities for people.
Yeah, your testimonials are probably a mile long, I'm sure. And so before we kind of coming to the end of the conversation, but maybe share with us a little bit of the resources and things that people can find when they come to your website, and yeah, what can they find?
Yeah. So we have a cognitive questionnaire on the website that I encourage anybody that's interested. You can either do it for yourself, or you can do it for your child, or you can do it for your spouse if you want. And it's got a number of questions, and at the end of it, it will give you a report on your cognitive profile. So it's based on your answers. It's never as accurate as if you do the assessment, but if you're pretty self-aware and answer the questions based on your understanding and experience of your functioning, it will show you at the end, okay, these areas look like they're working well, and here's what they are. And then these areas look like, maybe they're underperforming. So certainly people get a lot of insight out of that cognitive questionnaire. So I'd encourage you, and it's free and it's confidential. Then there's a series of webinars that we've done for people to understand how the brain shapes us, like this whole looking at behavior through a cognitive lens, because we each have our own unique cognitive profile, and that shapes our experience in the world. So it's, I think, a really useful resource for people to go in and look at. And we have a number of blogs on various topics as well. So I would encourage people to go on the website and just explore all the resources. There are a couple of books, The Brain Pioneer and Brain School, written by Howard Eaton, who he's kindly made those free downloads on the website. So if people are interested. So there's a lot of great resources. And if people are interested in say you've done the cognitive questionnaire and you want to, have a conversation with somebody, you can look at either contacting somebody in my organization via email, or depending on where you are in the world, there are different organizations, so you can have a conversation with somebody that might be in your part of the world. So yes, I just encourage you really do a deep dive into our website and all the resources that are there.
Yeah. And yes, of course, we are going to put all of your links and everything, wherever people find the conversation, they will be able to also find the links. So yes, definitely encourage, as you say, to go and have a look. I've done the cognitive quiz thing, and it was quite interesting. Yes, definitely going back there. Barbara, it was such an honor to have you here with us on the conversation. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story and your wisdom and all the incredible work that you're doing in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I mean, one of my passions is building awareness, for this magnificent organ that we carry with us everywhere we go, our brain.
Thank you.
Thank you.